Our speaker tonight is the author of a book, Buried by the Times, The Holocaust in America's Most Reported Newspaper, came out last year, which is the title of this presentation. Laurel Leff is an associate professor of journalism at Northeastern University, formerly a reporter with the Wall Street Journal, Miami Herald, and editor with American Lawyer Media and the Hartford Current. She has her undergraduate degrees from Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton, and she holds graduate degrees from Yale University and the University of Miami. The New York Times, I don't need to tell you, today is undoubtedly the paper of record, and so it's sometimes hard to imagine that it had a kind of black spot on its past. For American Jews, certainly the New York Times is something of a secular Talmud. And it's especially difficult now when you see all the coverage that it has of Jewish affairs and Jewish matters to imagine that it was a paper known as an anti-Semitic paper in some circles, despite the fact that its ownership was Jewish. And I sort of keep tabs on my favorite articles regarding Jews as they appear in the New York Times. For example, there was an article by Seth Wyman in 2002 about the last Jews on Burma, and this was followed by an article later that year about the last two Jews in Kabul, Afghanistan, and similarly articles about bombings in Istanbul, of synagogues, or in Casablanca, Jewish community centers, or the last remaining Jews discovered in Baghdad when American forces arrived there. These are themes which the New York Times seems to revel in, that is, the last Jews. And I don't know if it's a genre or not of journalism, but it does appear, and I thought of this as I read Professor Leff's book, I thought of this phenomenon of these recurrent articles about the last two Jews in any particular place. So not to make light of this topic, but it seems to be, in fact, a theme that goes back to the Holocaust. Professor Leff's book is an amazing study of an American institution. I recommend it to you, not just as in the context of Holocaust studies, but in the context of how newspapers work, personalities involved in deciding what is news and what is newsworthy. Certainly, you know, the New York Times has the little squib on the top, all the news that fit print, even though that might be the New York Times motto. It was not the case 55, 60 years ago. Professor Leff's book has been praised by reviewers for being a devastating account. Reviewers use the word relentless and thoroughly researched. Again, this is a book which goes right to the heart of the matter, of the subject that has been too long ignored. It's my great pleasure to welcome to the stage Laurel Leff.
The weather is like this all the time, right? And I particularly like to be asked to speak during Yom HaShoah, or Holocaust Remembrance Week, because especially as the events recede in time, it seems as if we really do need to force ourselves at least once a year to confront the past, And I use the word forced deliberately because I think it's something that, because of the horrific nature of the event and the pain and guilt associated with it, it's something that not a lot of people want to make themselves do. So I think it's good that we've picked a year and a time that we really do make ourselves do that. And it's particularly nice when you see a week that's been put together with such care and with such interesting speakers. And we just very briefly at dinner, I met the person who's going to be speaking tomorrow night, Jack Terry, and I hope you all go to hear him because I think it's going to be a very interesting lecture. Unfortunately, I'm flying off to give some talks in Ohio, so I won't be here, but I do encourage you to do that. And he's going to be talking about something different. I mean, he will be talking about his experiences and the Holocaust itself. What I'm going to be talking about tonight is more what might be considered the American response to the Holocaust, and in particular the media's response to the Holocaust. And I think that that is a topic that we haven't quite addressed enough, and as I mean as Americans. I mean, we've been very critical, and justifiably so, of the Germans and the Poles and the French and their failures to confront their past. And although our complicity isn't at the same level, I do think there are a lot of issues and ways in which we as Americans haven't faced up to our role in the Holocaust and are dealing with those particular events. And I'll talk more about that as I go along tonight. But now I'd like to start by going back to March 2nd, 1944. And that would have been a typical news day, if any day could be considered typical in the middle of a world war. And on the front page of the New York Times on that particular day, what you would see would be front page stories about the Allies holding off a drive near Anzio in Italy, about the Russians retaking parts of their territory that had been claimed by the Germans. That would be on the front page. And then inside the newspaper, there would be a story about the War Manpower Commission setting up labor service centers in New York State. There was another story about West Point retaining its unbeaten streak in basketball, a story about the stock market regaining ground, and the bridge of San Luis Rey opened at the Capitol Theater. And then on page 4, amid 13 other stories, appeared a 5-paragraph item with a London dateline about the House of Commons' decision to appropriate funds to the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees. And then came these paragraphs, and I'm going to quote from the story directly. I'm not going to do a lot of reading tonight, but sometimes I think it's important to understand the actual words that were used in the story. So here again, this is page 4, 13 other stories around it, a couple paragraphs on top of it, and then came these words. During the discussion, S.S. Silverman, labor member, read a report from the Jewish National Committee operating somewhere in Poland, saying, and then this is a quote directly from the Jewish National Committee, "Last month, we still reckoned the number of Jews in the whole territory of Poland as from 250,000 to 300,000. In a few weeks, no more than 50,000 of us will remain. In our last moment before death, the remnants of Polish Jewry appeal for help to the whole world. May this, perhaps our last voice from the abyss, reach the ears of the whole world." Then, without skipping a beat, the story continued. The Commons also approved an installment of £3,863 to help the International Red Cross open an office in Shanghai. The journalists at the New York Times did not respond to that anguished cry, not on that day or any of the 2,076 days of the European War. From the start of the war in Europe on September 1st, 1939, to its end nearly 6 years later, the New York Times and other mass media treated the persecution and ultimately the annihilation of the Jews of Europe as a secondary story. They reported it, and this is important. This is not a case of there not being stories. In fact, the New York Times published 1,186 stories about what was happening to the Jews of Europe, or an average of a story every other day. but the story of the Holocaust, meaning articles that focused on the discrimination, deportation, and destruction of the Jews, made the Times front page only 26 times, and that would have been out of 24,000 front page stories. And only in 6 of those stories were Jews identified on the front page as the primary victims. So what I'd like to do tonight is try to explain how that could have happened, how journalists at the New York Times and elsewhere could have been confronted with the facts of mass murder on an unprecedented scale and for unimaginable reasons, and yet reacted as if they had no understanding of what those facts meant. And when I'm done, I'm hoping that you'll all have questions for me, because that's my favorite part of doing this, is hearing what you're thinking about and what you're interested in. So the way I'm going to start is by giving you the reasons that I don't think explain the New York Times failure to cover this adequately. And a lot of these have been explanations that have been offered either in the popular press or even in the scholarly press for the lack of attention to the Holocaust. So again, these are the reasons I don't think explain it. The first explanation that is given is that the information was unavailable. And I think the conventional wisdom was basically that the Holocaust was, while it was happening, a deep, dark secret. And maybe some rumors reached the United States and other places in the West, but basically this was something that Americans didn't know and couldn't know until Americans liberated the concentration camps at the end of the war. But I think over the last 2 decades, a consensus has emerged that a considerable amount of information reached the British and American governments, Jewish groups, the Catholic Church, the Red Cross, and the news media about what was happening to the Jews during World War II. And I think the best evidence of that is the 1,186 stories in the New York Times. How big a secret could it have been? I still think this is a very hard thing to grasp, and the conventional wisdom on this runs very deep. So I'm going to spend some time giving you an idea of not only the number of stories, but also what was in those stories, to give you a sense of the kind of coverage that was in fact in the New York Times. So if we talk about the first 2.5 years of the war, which would basically be from September of '39 to December of 1942, what you would have found in the New York Times were stories about anti-Semitic legislation that was enacted in the countries that either were occupied or allied with the Germans. So there were stories about the fact that Jews couldn't be doctors or lawyers or pharmacists, that their property could be confiscated, that they had to live in only certain parts of the city, that they couldn't ride on tram cars, the sort of whole gamut of social and economic ostracism. Then there were stories about the deportations of Jews. When Germany decided to start sending Jews from all parts of Europe to Poland, there were hundreds of stories about those deportations, and they often were very specific and very timely. So what these stories would say would be exactly what town was being cleared of Jews, how many Jews were being deported, their ages, what they were allowed to take with them, how long their trip would be, and where they would go once they were to arrive in Poland. And often these would be a reporting on events that happened the night before. So for example, there was one story about 2,000 Viennese Jews being deported last night, and they were to arrive in Lublin, Poland, in however many days their trip would take. Then there also were stories about the establishments of ghettos in Poland. And again, this would say the names of the towns, how many Jews would be sealed in the ghetto, and sometimes, again, they were very timely. So the day after the Warsaw Ghetto was closed off, there was a story in the New York Times the next day with a headline that says, 500,000 Jews to begin new life behind ghetto walls. So there were many stories about that. And then there were also stories about the conditions in those ghettos. They would specify the rations in the ghettos, the death rate in the ghettos, the diseases that were stalking the ghettos, and there were many stories about that. There were also stories about the pogroms that began in Romania in 1940 and 1941 and ended up killing tens of thousands of Jews there. And there were some stories, although this was probably the least reported part of both the war and the Holocaust, but there were some stories about what happens when the Germans broke the Nazi-Soviet pact and invaded Russia in the summer of 1941 and began going from town to town, from shtetl to shtetl, taking the Jews from in those towns, bringing them to the outskirts of town, making them dig their own graves, and then usually machining them and gunning them in front of those graves. So that would have been what you would have found in the Times in the first 2.5 years of the war. In the last 3.5 years, the Times published stories on the operation of extermination centers at Treblinka, Auschwitz, and other places, and named those particular places. They described the rising death rates in those centers. So there'd be one story saying 2 million Jews were dead, and then 6 months later there'd be another story saying 3 million Jews were dead, and then 6 months later there'd be another update explaining that now 4 million Jews were dead. There were even some first-person accounts, because what happens in 1943 is that the Russians begin to reclaim parts of their territory that the Germans had occupied. They come across the scenes of massacres, and the New York Times is one of the only Moscow correspondents who actually speaks Russian, so he begins interviewing some of these survivors of the massacre at Vilna and Kharkov and other places, and puts their accounts into the New York Times. There are even stories on what we would now consider to be some of the seminal events of the Holocaust, such as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was reported as it was occurring from the first resistance in the ghetto in March of 1943 to the ultimate liquidation of the ghetto in June of 1943. And there were stories about the rescue of the Danish Jews, when the Jews in Denmark learned that on Rosh Hashanah 1943 that the Jews were going to be sent to Poland to what was presumed to be their death. They decided to help them escape and ferry them across a river to Sweden to safety, and there were stories again, about a dozen stories as that was happening. But as I said, almost all of these stories were inside the newspaper. So there was a great deal of information, but most of it was inside the newspaper. So I think the idea that the information was unavailable is just wrong. So another explanation that was offered was, okay, well, maybe the information was available, but it was unreliable. It was based on hearsay accounts, or it came from biased Jewish sources. So you couldn't really quite trust that. But I don't think that that explanation holds up either. And when you actually look at the sources that the journalists use for the information, what you discover is that, yes, some of the information comes from Jewish organizations, from the World Jewish Congress and other groups, but it also comes from German sources. And aside from the actual extermination campaign itself, the Germans did not keep this secret, and in fact put out what might be considered the equivalent of press releases about establishment of ghettos or about new legislation requiring Jews to wear yellow stars, and all of that was very upfront. They were very upfront about it. And also, a great deal of the information comes from what is called from the exile government. So what happened was that when Germany invaded Poland, for example, a number of Polish leaders fled their country. They went to London. They reconstituted themselves as an exile government in London and maintained contacts with the underground in Poland. And so almost all of the information, particularly about the extermination campaign, came from the Polish government in exile, which was putting out press releases, holding press conferences, sometimes in concert with the World Jewish Congress. And most importantly, almost this information was confirmed by the 11 Allied nations in December of 1942. It was confirmed by the United States government, the British government, and the other governments. So I don't think at that point it was considered unreliable. Also, most of the stories say that the information actually comes from reliable sources. That's in the story. So I think the idea that the information was unreliable also doesn't hold up. Well, then the third explanation is, okay, the the information may have been available, it may have been reliable, but it was not, in some sense, believable. And I think that's encapsulated by the phrase, too horrible to be true. So here the idea is that, yes, people were receiving reports about the extermination of the Jews and that millions of them were being killed in gas chambers, but people couldn't quite believe it. It just didn't seem as if that could possibly occur. And I think there's something to this explanation. I mean, I think that we all, in some senses, and I know I still do, have the reaction when you read about these events that this couldn't possibly have happened, that people couldn't do these things to other people. But I don't think that that means that you have a doubt about the accuracy of the information, that this may be more at sort of an existential level. And I think to some extent that that's the way that people at the time reacted as well. And more importantly, at least for what I'm interested in, I don't think that that existential sense of disbelief is what kept this from being a front page story in the New York Times and elsewhere. And here's why. The first reason is if that was what was keeping the story from being on the front page, then what you would expect is when the Allied governments, when our own government confirmed this information in December of 1942, then you would begin to see more front page stories. But what in fact is the case is that there are more front page stories in 1942 before the information was confirmed than there are in 1943 after the information was confirmed. So it doesn't seem as if that the lack of belief is what is keeping the story off of the front page. The other thing, and this may be even more important, is that the stories don't read as if the reporters writing them and the editors editing them don't believe them. And I'm going to give you a few examples of that. And again, I'm going to read a few of these stories because I think that what I'd like you to be doing as I'm reading them is for you to be asking yourself, does it sound as if the person who's writing the story, the person who's editing the story doesn't believe it? And the period I'm going to look at is the spring of 1944. And what's happened in the spring of 1944 is the Germans in March of 1944 invade Hungary. And before that, Hungary had been allied with the Germans. They had forced Jews into work formations, but they hadn't begun wholesale deportations of the Jews in Hungary to Poland. So in Hungary, you found the last intact Jewish community in Europe. There were about 800,000 Jews in Hungary at this point. And then the Germans invade in March, and they begin doing to the Hungarian Jews in a very short period what they had done to the Polish Jews in over a number of years. So they immediately start putting them in ghettos, and they immediately start deporting them to Auschwitz and Birkenau. And the first story about this, about the actual deportations, the stories about the ghettoization had been in the times before. But the first story was on May 10th, 1944, and I'm going to read you the lead of the story. Although it may sound unbelievable, it is a fact that Hungary, where Jewish citizens were comparatively well treated until March 19th, is now preparing for the annihilation of Hungarian Jews by the most fiendish methods. The puppet Nazi government is completing plans and about to start the extermination of about 1 million human beings. The story then goes on to explain that they will meet the same fate as more than 5 million Jews who have been put to death in one form or another by the Germans, including in gas chamber baths. That story appeared on page 5 of the New York Times. Then about a week later, on May 18th, there's another story, and again I'm going to read you the lead of the story. The first act in a program of mass extermination of Jews in Hungary is over, and 80,000 Jews of the Carpathian provinces have already disappeared. They have been sent to murder camps in Poland. Official reports from neutral diplomatic sources in Budapest emphasize that unless drastic measures are taken immediately to put an end to the Hungarian government's brutality, 1 million Hungarian Jews are doomed. And that story also appeared on page 5. In fact, all of the stories about the destruction of Hungary's Jews appeared on page 5 of the New York Times. And I'm going to read you one more story, actually one more paragraph, because I think in some ways this is the most chilling because of the routine way in which they describe the event. Now this is, I said it was not a story. What it is it's a paragraph that appears on the bottom of another story. There's another story, and these are also on page 5 story, but there's another story about how non-Jewish children need to be evacuated from Budapest because they're fearful of Allied bombings. And then the bottom of the story is tacked on this paragraph. A trainload of 2,500 Jewish men, women, and children was evacuated from the Kassa concentration ghetto Saturday night. The story appeared Monday, so that would have been 2 days before. If known schedules are adhered to, and that's the actual terms they used, if known schedules are adhered to, these victims will arrive in the Auschwitz and Birkenau camps by this weekend, probably with previous knowledge of their fate. A German report just received in Zurich says railroad sidings have been constructed directly to the gassing halls in both establishments to expedite matters. And then if there's still any doubt about whether these stories were believed, another place to turn would be to look at the editorials that the Times wrote. And the Times did publish about 17 editorials during the course of the war. Now, on the editorial page would be where if you had some misgivings about the information, you could express it more freely. You could say, we're getting reports that 2 million Jews have been killed, but we're not really sure about it, it may not be accurate. But on the editorial page, the Times treated this as established fact. In fact, they described it as established fact. And let me give you one example. They ran an editorial right after the Allied governments had confirmed the final solution. And in it, they explained that the Allied government statement is not an outcry of the victims themselves, to which many thought it possible to close their ears on the ground that it might be a special plea subject to doubt. It is the official statement of their own governments based on officially established facts. And then the final argument I would make for the fact that it was not the lack of believability that was keeping these stories off the front page is that the journalists at the time actually used this notion of it's too horrible to be true to reinforce the truth of what they were reporting. I mean, they would literally say, this information is too horrible to be true, but you must believe it. And let me give you one example of that. This is actually from a column that the New York Times Foreign Affairs columnist wrote. And in it, this appeared in March of 1943. She wrote, the barbarities we have witnessed and have heard of in the past 4 years are too nightmarish to be real. Yet they represent dreadful realities. There is not the slightest question that the persecution of the Jews has reached its awful climax in a campaign to wipe them out of Europe. So the information was available, and it was reliable, and it was, for the most part, believable. There's one last explanation that's been offered for why this wasn't front page news, and that was that there was more important news that took precedence. I mean, basically the idea is there's a world war going on, and there just isn't room on the front page to adequately cover the events of the war, the military campaigns, and also to report on what's happening to the Jews. But the problem with that argument is that there were a lot of stories that were on the front page of the New York Times. The Times during that era ran 12 to 15 stories on the front page on average. Now it runs maybe 6 or 7. And about half of them were about something else. So there wasn't really a literal problem of space. And again, let me just give you one example. On D-Day, the day of the invasion, the European invasion, most of the stories were devoted to that, not surprisingly. But there was room for a story with the following headline. Enraged bull kills 2 brothers, gores neighbor on Long Island. So the lack of literal space wasn't the explanation. So what does explain it? I've spent a lot of time talking about what I think doesn't explain why this wasn't treated as a front page story. What does explain why it wasn't treated as a front page story? Well, here I think you have to separate most of the media, which treated the story in basically the same way as the Times did, meaning that it ran some stories, not as many as the Times. The Times was more comprehensive, but almost all the stories were inside. And I think the first explanation is that the United States government chose not to highlight this information. They didn't censor it. I mean, obviously, if there were that many stories in the New York Times, they weren't engaged in censorship. And they didn't literally suppress it, except in a few instances. But what they did was they didn't emphasize it. So President Roosevelt didn't make any major speeches on what was happening to the Jews in Europe. And neither did the Secretary of State or the Secretary of War. When Roosevelt was asked about it, which he was very rarely, at press conferences he deflected the question. The Office of War Information, which was our propaganda agency, put out a few press releases on it, but they didn't make it a campaign. They didn't emphasize the news. And a press corps that mostly followed what government said and considered news coming out of the government to be more important than any other news, therefore followed along and chose to run the story inside. But that doesn't completely explain it, because I hope you can tell by just a few stories that I read for you tonight, there was enough information, the journalists knew enough, that they could have made it a front page story on their own, even without depending on the United States government. And I think the reason that most of the press corps didn't was because they assumed that their readers weren't interested. That at a time when American soldiers were fighting and dying in the Pacific and in North Africa, that most Americans just weren't going to be very interested in what was happening to a foreign minority group. And this is very deep-seated in journalism. I know when I teach beginning news writing classes, one of the news values you stress is something called proximity. So that one of the things that makes news more important is if it's close either geographically or emotionally to your readers. And there was an assumption that this kind of news wasn't of interest to most Americans and therefore didn't deserve to be on the front page. And let me quote you the reaction that one reporter who was reporting from Eastern Europe in 1944 and 1945 had to this. He wrote in a book just published right after the war. Editors cabled from Oh So Gentle America. Our readers are tired of horror stories. Cable only those of death rolls unusually large or deaths themselves unusually gruesome. Such stories could always be written on the basis of the experiences of the Jews, but alas, the editors then cabled, Jewish atrocity stories are not acceptable news material. Ah, America, America. So I think that explains, at least to some extent, I'm not sure it's a fully satisfying explanation, of how most of the mass media reacted. But the New York Times, as Professor Katz indicated, was in a somewhat different position. For one thing, I think the New York Times couldn't say as easily as the Des Moines Register or the Portland Oregonian that their readers weren't interested, because half the Jews in America lived in the New York metropolitan area. Most of them were first or second generation European Jews, and what that meant was that they had mothers or fathers, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins who were being marched into the gas chambers. For many American Jews, this was not about some distant other, this was about their family. The other reason is that the New York Times itself was owned by a Jewish family, and a family of German Jewish descent. And for them, as happened to a lot of Jews in America, they began in the 1930s receiving letters from relatives who were still in Germany asking to help sponsor them to come to the United States. So for the owners of the New York Times, too, this was not happening to some distant other, this was happening to their families. So then what explains the reaction of the New York Times? I think the irony and the tragedy is that the fact that the Times was owned by a Jewish newspaper actually made them more likely to downplay the news. And here's why. The Times had long, since it had been bought by a Jew in 1896, had not wanted to be identified as a Jewish newspaper. They were very concerned about that. They felt as if they were identified, the Times was identified as a Jewish newspaper, that it would hurt its credibility among the establishment that it was very set on catering to and having influence among. Now, that presented them with a problem in the 1930s, because it's one thing to say we're not going to treat this news release by some Jewish organization as big news. It's another thing to say there's this terrible persecution of the Jews going on in Germany, and to say, well, we're not going to treat that as important news. But I think what the Times did, and this is based on looking at internal memos and other documentation, is that they decided to play down the news for fear of being accused of playing it up. And basically the idea was that they didn't want to look as if they were engaged in what we might be described as special pleading on behalf of a minority group of which they were a member. So there was a deliberate decision to run the stories. Again, it was not, we're not going to treat this news at all, but we're going to put most of the stories inside the newspaper. And when we write about it on the editorial page or on the front page, then we're going to at least blur the fact that the Jews are the primary victims of the extermination campaign. So we're going to refer in editorials again or on the front page to refugees, or we're going to talk about Jews and other persecuted minorities, or we're going to include Jews among a long list of suffering people. It was often said, particularly in editorials, that the Jews were the first to suffer, but now everyone's suffering, the Poles, the Finns, the Danes. And I think the result of that was that it was, if you looked at just the front page stories or looked at the editorials, it would have been somewhat difficult to figure out what was happening to the Jews in Europe. If you looked inside the newspaper and at the inside stories, it was very clear. But if you were just a casual reader of the Times, it may not have been as apparent. And I think this attitude permeated throughout the New York Times organization because, of course, the publisher of the Times, who set this policy, also set the tone and set what was considered the sensitivity to Semitism that was part of the New York Times. So what was the impact of it? Well, I think for one thing, the Times had a disproportionate impact. Because not only was it the paper of record, but it was really the paper that opinion leaders, whether they were in the American government or other journalists, looked to set the agenda, and particularly to set the agenda on foreign issues. Because at that point, there weren't many other newspapers. In fact, you could probably only point to a handful that even bothered with foreign news besides sort of the war coverage. So the Times was really identified as a newspaper that paid attention to foreign affairs. And then also, frankly, it was a newspaper that was looked to on Jewish issues, because no matter how much the publisher would not want the Times to be considered a Jewish newspaper, everybody knew that the owners of the Times were Jewish. And I think there was an attitude, particularly on the part of other journalists, that if the New York Times, which was owned by Jews, didn't consider what was happening to the Jews in Europe to be an important story, why should they? So I think the Times' effect was even beyond its just being the newspaper of record. And the result of that was that it was very difficult to arouse public opinion, to adopt any policies that might have helped to save some Jews. Because I think by publishing the stories in inside, isolated stories, and doing nothing to call readers' attention to the stories, that it did mean that for most readers, whether ordinary citizens or opinion makers, they could have claimed legitimately not to know, or at least not to have understood what was happening to the Jews. And the generally ignorant American public made it easier for our government to do what it wanted to do, which was not do anything besides trying to win the war. Now, that doesn't mean that millions of Jews could have been saved, or even hundreds of thousands of Jews could have been saved had the Times acted differently. But what is true is that those possibilities were never really tested, because without there being stories about this, it really wasn't possible to arouse public opinion. And what are some, and this is the way I'm going to conclude, what are some of the lessons that we can draw from this? I think the first lesson, and this I think is particularly important during Holocaust Memorial Week, which is, I think we, and again I mean we as Americans, need to get past this idea that the information wasn't available. Because as long as you say the information wasn't available and we couldn't have known what was happening, then you don't have to look any deeper to try and figure out why the response to this information was, for the most part, indifference, whether it was indifference on the part of the American government or indifference on the part of American journalists. So the first point is to say there was information available, and then we can begin to have a conversation about why Americans reacted the way they did. So that's kind of the general lesson. I think for journalists, I mean, as Professor Katz had indicated, I come from a journalism background. I was a journalist for 18 years before I became an academic. So in some ways, I see this as more, I mean, it's important to understand its history, but it's also important to understand the lessons you can take from this as a journalist. And the first lesson I take from this as a journalist is that it's not enough to just put the information in the newspaper. I know when I was an editor, often people would call and they would complain and they'd say, why aren't you covering some events? And I would say, oh yes, we are in fact covering that event. Look, there was a story on page 17, there was another story on page 7, but what doing this research has convinced me of is if these facts, if these incredibly horrible stories weren't recognized when they appeared on page 5 or when they were obscured in editorials, then other much more mundane events aren't going to be recognized. So that if journalists think something is important and they think their readers need to know it, then they have to do everything they possibly can to draw their readers' attention to it, by putting the stories on the front page, by writing editorials, by doing magazine pieces about it. So that's sort of the first lesson. And then the second lesson, and this is related to that, is that it's not good enough to say your audience isn't interested. As I think many editors said during the 1930s and 1940s. I would love to run these stories on the front page, but my audience just wouldn't be interested. And the fact of the matter is, as a journalist, you don't really know what your audience is interested in. You might have guesses, you might make assumptions, but you don't really know. And what that means then is it's just a little bit too easy to project your own biases onto your audience and use them as an excuse for your own refusal or your own decision not to treat a story as important. And then the next related lesson is that, again, if you think it's important and you're afraid that your audience isn't interested, then you need to figure out some way to make them be interested. That's part of your obligation as a journalist. And let me give you one example of how that did work and how it might have worked. Right after September 11th, the New York Times, in fact, ran a rather remarkable series called Portraits of Grief. And what they did is that they devoted a full page in the New York Times to short profiles of the people who had been killed in the World Trade Center or at the Pentagon. And they weren't big deals. They were just a couple paragraphs, and they ran a photo if they had a photo, and it would just say what the person's name was and where they worked and what their hobbies were and if they had kids, and maybe you might say a little bit about how they died. But what it did was it made you begin to understand what it meant to lose 3,000 people. Because you see 3,000 and it doesn't have any meaning. But when you read those profiles, and I did, I mean, I almost felt a religious obligation every day to read those profiles, you began to get a sense of what was lost. And as I was reading those profiles in the New York Times, I was thinking, what if the Times had done something like that during the Holocaust? What if they had tried to make their readers understand what was happening, that lives were actually being lost? And of course, as soon as I did that, I started doing the calculations, and I realized very quickly that to do that, the Times would have had to devote every page of every newspaper for the entirety of the war to these portraits of grief, because that's what it means to lose 6 million people. But whether they actually could have done it, and whether it would have made any difference, I don't know. But what I do know is that they should have tried. Thank you. I'm happy to, and I hope there are questions. I like questions. Thank you for asking me questions. Yes?
Was there any paper either here or abroad that did focus
That's a great question, and the answer is yes. Certainly the Jewish newspapers in the United States, and there were some either in Yiddish or in English, and they did focus a lot more attention on it. Interestingly enough, the liberal press wrote many more stories about this. So the Nation magazine, the New Republic, some of them still exist, did many stories on this. The New Republic in August of 1943 devoted an entire issue to the extermination of the Jews in Europe. There was a newspaper in New York at the time called PM, which was set up to be a liberal newspaper, and they ran many more stories about it. The British press in general did a somewhat better job with the story as well. So there were some newspapers, but it really needed it to get into the mass American newspapers for it to have an effect upon the government, because the American government, President Roosevelt in particular, was very public relations savvy, and they were monitoring the American press very closely, and it sort of needed to be in those kinds of publications for, I think, for it to make a difference. Yes?
You mentioned that the first reason why it was not on the front page was, on another, that the American government wasn't interested in making it an important question. Now, it's not part of your talk, but would you care to comment why was the American government not interested in the fate of the Jews?
Well, I think that might be putting it a little too starkly. I mean, I don't think that, it's not that they were not interested, it was that it wasn't a priority, which might be a somewhat subtle difference. But what I mean by that is that I don't think that they wanted Jews to die. I mean, I don't think that they were happy this was happening. But I do think that there was a decision not to make it a priority. And I think the reason it wasn't a priority was probably twofold. On one hand, they had a lot to do. I mean, Roosevelt, I mean, especially if you focus on Roosevelt, you know, it was as much, I think, in some ways as he could handle or thought he could handle, to just try and win the war. So I think the focus was on trying to win the war and not having to deal with any other distractions if they didn't have to deal with any other distractions. So I think that's sort of where the motivation was coming from, because it would have been difficult. I mean, once we already went to war with Germany, then you were talking about the rescue things that were being suggested were somewhat difficult to implement. I mean, with varying degrees depending on what you were talking about. But then the second reason was, why wasn't it a priority? I mean, in some ways the first question kind of begs the bottom line, which is why wasn't it a priority? And I think it wasn't a priority. To some extent, there was a certain amount of anti-Semitism in it, at least in terms of this kind of genteel anti-Semitism that was prevalent in that class at that time. And then there were just sort of more hardcore political reasons, which was that Jews are a very small percentage of the population. And I think Roosevelt concluded they were going to vote for him anyway. He didn't have to worry about losing their support. So if he could just keep it an issue that was below the radar, then he didn't have to deal with it. And so that was the decision, is if we could just deflect it, not not have it be something that people are agitating about beyond a few Jewish organizations, then we don't have to sort of take on this other difficult problem when we're in the midst of many difficult problems. So, and that's my reading of what transpired. Yes?
Our soldiers who liberated some of the camps seem to have been genuinely shocked. I mean, totally unprepared for what they were seeing. I'm wondering, has anyone considered why they were unprepared in any way by, for example, Stars and Stripes? Why wasn't the word?
That's an easier question. Okay. I mean, if you look, and there have been, I mean, Yank magazine and Stars and Stripes, there was generally a feeling among the American government related to the previous question that it wasn't good propaganda to play up what was happening to the Jews. I mean, and that's what, if you look at the Office of War Information, which was the propaganda agency, and I looked at their files, I mean, there are memos that say, we don't want to emphasize what's happening to the Jews. If we're going to write about it, we need to generalize about it, because there was a feeling it wasn't going to be good propaganda. Then when you look particularly at the military publications, I mean, there was one incident where a reporter for, it's actually Yank magazine, which is like Stars and Stripes, it was another one of these military publications, wanted to write about the atrocities that were going on in Europe. And at that time there was, the War Refugee Board was in existence. It was an agency that was created specifically to try and save Jews at the very end of the war. And so they went to them and said, give us some information on what's happening on the atrocities, and they came back and indicated that it was almost over 90% of those being killed were Jews. And they went, and the reporter went back and told them, well, we can't write about these Jewish atrocities, give us some other atrocities. And the War Refugee Board said, these are the atrocities. And Yank magazine wouldn't publish it. So, I mean, if you're talking about anti-Semitism, there's a very deep strain of anti-Semitism in the military. So the soldiers were deliberately not prepared for that. Now, if you ask more generally why, you know, there are all these stories in the New York Times, why soldiers who liberated the camps reacted that way, and I've often, you know, talked to things where people who have been liberators and they said the same thing, we didn't know, we hadn't heard about it. I think it gets back to this question of if stories are inside the newspaper, if there's a lot going on, then it is possible not to have known, not to have focused on it. And then the third thing is, I do think that there is a sense of where if you're not seeing it, I mean, you can read about it, but you're still going to walk into those places and be horrified, shocked, unprepared. Even if you had read about it and sort of knew intellectually what was going on, you still wouldn't necessarily have known emotionally what was going on. Yes, Lady Henry?
I don't really fully understand what the risk would have been to the Times of really focusing on the story, putting them on the front page, putting forth the red editorial. What really would they have risked? What would have been the ramifications?
Well, I mean, I think what you can talk about is what they thought they were risking. Because I probably would agree with you. I don't think they were risking very much. And in fact, I do think that this was a sensitivity on the part of the publisher that other people would sort of say to him, you know, don't worry about it. I mean, there was one incident where editor and publisher had written something about the Jewish market for newspapers, and the publisher sort of went ballistic about this and wrote them this enraged editorial, and the editor and publisher wrote back and said, relax, you know, people know that the Times is a distinguished newspaper. So I think this might have had more to do with the psyche of the publisher and his own conflicted feelings than maybe the reality. But certainly I think what he feared was, I mean, he was very dedicated to the idea of himself as an American. And not that he hid being Jewish. He did not hide that he was Jewish. He always acknowledged it. He was a member of 4 synagogues. I mean, he was not in that kind of denial. But he wanted to be viewed as an American first and foremost. And of course, at that time, one of the charges that was levied against Jews, and maybe it still is, was this notion of dual loyalty. You know, that the Jew is always going to be, they may say they're American and they're loyal to America, but they're more loyal to their fellow Jews. And so I think it was that notion that he would be accused if he looked as if he was being too sensitive to what was happening to Jews, that it would somehow or other impugn him as an American. And that was just, you know, very, very deep in his psyche. Yes?
I am very interested in how the Times treated the news about the Holocaust after the war. In other words, one of the things that we learned from not just the Times, but any newspaper, is that if they found, if it has been shown that they in fact neglected some important news stories, I think of the WMD stories with respect to Iraq, which where the Times dropped the ball along with other newspapers. I'm wondering if there hasn't been a kind of reaction to that failure, that perceived failure on their part, overcompensating. What do you see if you look at the news about the Holocaust after the war, when it was more generally known for the place, and then up to the Nuremberg trial?
Yeah, I actually did look at both of those things. And the first thing to say about the liberation of the concentration camps is that most of the news stories about that didn't mention Jews. So we have, again, this notion that that's when the world realized what had happened to the Jews. And then the Holocaust became known to most people. But when you actually look at the news coverage, what you discover is that what people learned was that the Germans did really horrible things. But what they did really horrible things to were all different people in Europe. So that the inmates of concentration camps are almost always described by nationality. So they're Czechs or they're Poles or they're French, but they're not Jews. I mean, there are almost no references to Jews in the liberation stories. So what that means is that you weren't really getting this, oh my God, look what happened to the Jews reaction. You're getting this, oh my God, look what happened reaction. And that actually carries through to the Nuremberg trials too. First of all, the Nuremberg trials, again, we have a different notion of what it was about than what it was really about. And most of the focus of the Nuremberg trials was on aggressive war and on the Germans attacking various countries. And only a very small part of it focused on crimes against humanity, and even a smaller part focused on crimes against the Jews. It was there, but it was really submerged. And when you look at the press coverage of the Nuremberg trials, what you find is that it's even more deeply submerged in the press coverage. So there's almost, again, no discussion of the Holocaust in the coverage of the Nuremberg trials. So we didn't have that kind of moment of awakening, and then what happens is that most people assume that there weren't any news stories. I mean, we very quickly developed an amnesia about it. So the accounting, I don't think, it hasn't even really taken place. I mean, it's really just starting to take place. There wasn't that moment of recognition at the time. And certainly on the part of the publisher at the time, I mean, even though, you know, what happened to him, again, happened to many people in the United States, which was, at the end of the war, one of his relatives, for example, who had been in Germany, fled Germany to Holland, was in hiding in Holland, and then was discovered by the Gestapo, and she was shipped first to Ravensbrück and then to Auschwitz, and then, you know, did the march to Velsen. And she, when she's liberated, she goes to Holland and she writes this 20-page letter describing what had happened to her, and she sends it to the family who were in the United States, and one of them, you know, carefully translates it into English and sends a copy to the publisher of the New York Times, and he reads it, and he sends a note to the editor of the magazine saying, I don't think there's anything in here for us. And the editor of the magazine writes back and says, yes, there are a lot of sad stories like this coming out of Europe, but it's not news for us. So even when confronted with it, it still doesn't change his attitudes or his feeling about how the story was covered. Yes?
I wonder if you make any comparison to current atrocities, or in the last decade, Darfur or the stories in other stories in Africa with millions of people also were killed. How well were they covered in the front page of the Times and other magazines?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done a study myself, but I've read most of the secondary literature on it, and I think what it's safe to say is that the press does a better job, the American press, that those stories are more likely to be front page stories certainly than the Holocaust was, but at the same time, you can't say that they're doing a good job or as good a job as they should be. I mean, it's still too often an inside story. It almost never is treated on the network news, which is now sort of a more important source of that kind of information. I think it's also true that the press still tends to take its cues from the American government. So if Colin Powell goes to Africa, or Condoleezza Rice goes to Africa, or George Bush says something about Darfur, then it's in the press. But if the government isn't talking about it, then the press isn't reporting about it as much. And that the press still isn't looking hard enough at what the government's motivations might be for wanting to keep the story below the radar. And I think it's actually quite similar to the reasons that they were during the 1940s, which is if it becomes a public issue and there's a lot of attention on it, then they have to figure out how to do something about it, and they would rather not have to figure out how to do something about it. So I think in some ways we've learned some things, but we probably haven't learned enough. Yes.
The Evian conference and what happened to the St. Louis
Right.
ship. I'm wondering how was that covered? And certainly that was something that was on our shores.
Right, and actually, yeah, the St. Louis, which was the ship that had set sail from Germany with about 900 Jewish refugees on board, most of them seemingly had fake passports into Cuba. When they arrived, Cuba wouldn't admit them. They then sailed up to Miami. They weren't allowed to land, and ultimately the ship was sent back to Europe. The Times actually covered that on the front page. But what's interesting about that episode, and it actually relates to the Evian conference as well, which was, there was a big emphasis on the part of the Times and also the United States government to not, again, make this just about the Jews. So when the Times editorialized about the St. Louis, there are two striking things about it. The first was they didn't describe the people on the boat as Jewish. They were all refugees, and they said of many different nationalities and religions. The second thing that was interesting about it is that the two editorials that they wrote about it, both of which were their last of 7 editorials they ran that day, both appeared after the ship had already turned around. So they didn't write these editorials, and they were in some ways very moving editorials, but they didn't appear until the ship was already going back to Europe, and they never called for them to be admitted to the United States. I mean, the New York Times never called for a change in immigration quotas to allow more refugees into the United States. Yes.
Mr. Leff, thank you for sharing all your research with us. It's very informative talk. I noted that you mentioned that you did do some research with internal memos.
Yeah, that was where most of the
And I'm wondering if you could speak a little about that research to answer this question. It seems my understanding of print media is writers write stories that feel might have certain urgency about their stories, but then editors and publishers decide where they go.
Right.
And I'm wondering if in internal memos you came across writers who were ardent about this being further up in the paper, and you actually saw conversations about, no, this goes here, or a denial of the writer's sense of urgency.
That's a good question. You saw a little bit of that. I mean, one of the things, and this I think is the way decisions about what's an important story can be reinforcing, is that when it was decided that this wasn't important, what that meant was they never sent one reporter to follow the news. So it wasn't as if they said, here, you be the person to pay attention to what's happening to the Jews in Europe. This was done in many different bureaus by many different reporters. So it was covered out of London and out of Stockholm and out of Bern and Berlin and France when there still were reporters there, and out of Jerusalem actually, too. So there wasn't one reporter who sort of had responsibility for this. The second thing that this meant was that the reporters who were writing about this, for the most part, were not the stars in the New York Times. The stars were with the troops, or they might have been in London covering the Blitz. So these were kind of secondary reporters that the Times editors didn't have a lot of faith in, and weren't necessarily the kind of reporters who would be exerting themselves in terms of placement, in terms of getting more attention. Now, what some reporters did do was assert the accuracy of their story. So there's one episode where a reporter in Stockholm actually writes about the massacre that occurs at Panari, right outside of Vilna, in June of 1942. And he sends this story about it. And one of it goes through Bern, and one of the reporters in Bern sort of expresses some doubts about the story, and then the editor of New York cables him back and says, are you sure that this information is right? And he then attaches an affidavit of his sources, and goes through sort of meticulously all the other evidence that these kinds of massacres are going on, but it doesn't change the placement of the story. And then there was one other, sort of example of that, which again sort of coincides with this notion of if it's not a reporter that has a lot of weight, they can't do very much about it. So for example, in all the stories I read about the destruction of the Hungarian Jews, and there were probably about, 10 of them in the New York Times, were all written by a reporter named Joseph Levy. And Levy he was born in the United States, but then he moved to Jerusalem, and he was their Jerusalem correspondent. But he didn't get along with the British. The British thought he was too pro-Zionist. He was too in favor of there being a Jewish state in Palestine. So he wasn't given accreditation in the Middle Eastern theater. So they actually sent him to Turkey, and from Turkey he covers the destruction of Hungary's Jews. But his editors really didn't think very highly of him. There's no question about that, reading the memos. So, they didn't think his information wasn't accurate, because then they wouldn't have published it at all. But they certainly weren't going to say, because it's a Joe Levy story, we're going to put it on the front page. So he didn't have that kind of sway within the organization. And that's true pretty much of everybody who was writing about this story. Yes.
Was there, in your research, did you notice, was there any communication with the government asking the newspaper publishers to keep?
I didn't find any evidence of that. That was obviously, the question, if you didn't hear it, was whether there was any evidence that the government had specifically asked the journalists not to play up this story, and I didn't find anything to indicate that. It was mostly couched in how are we going to propagandize this, and what message should we be putting out, as opposed to anything that I said. And maybe that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Maybe it was communicated verbally rather than in writing. But I sort of doubt it. I think they were fairly confident that if the government treated it in a certain way, the journalists would go along. And I think that's partially because they were in sync with the government. It wasn't just they were just naturally doing what the government wanted. And there's been a fair amount written about how, particularly during World War II, that the press was much more compliant than it is now in terms of how it responded to news of the government. But what you actually found is a couple of instances where the journalists were willing to, there was voluntary censorship, at least for domestic news. If you were talking about military theater, then there was out-and-out censorship. But there were times when the American press did challenge the voluntary censorship, particularly after Pearl Harbor. They told the government that if the government didn't acknowledge how many ships were sunk and information, they were going to go public on it anyway and force the government into releasing the information. And interestingly, the press did the same thing with stories about atrocities that occurred, that were committed by the Japanese against American soldiers and against Filipino civilians. There had been, unlike the stories in Germany, in Europe, there had actually been part of what they had asked the press not to cover was atrocities that were going on in Japan, and there again, the press threatened to run the stories anyway, and forced the government into, for example, releasing information on the death marches of Bataan. And then the American press did, story after story, front page stories about that for a full week. So they had a different policy on those kinds of atrocities.
So of the 26 stories that made the front page, did the analysis of those deal with any trends as to what the subject matter was or when they were the time period?
It wasn't subject matter, but the source of the information did matter. So of those, over half were ones that were stories that came from the government. So that, again, sort of reinforces when the government did say something about it, or a government official said something. One of the stories is a statement by Thomas Dewey, who's running for president in 1944. So if there's a statement from a government official, that was more likely to get on the front page. The other kinds of stories that were more likely to get on the front page were if the Catholic Church, if the Vatican said something about it. The Times was very focused on the Vatican and on the Catholic Church generally. But if it looked, there are two stories that are front page stories where there's a rumor that the Pope might do something on behalf of the Jews, and those both were front page stories. There also were, interestingly enough, more front page stories about the persecution of Catholics than there were about the persecution of Jews. That seemed to be a safer subject for the Times. This also kind of, suggests why I focused on one of these organizations, but the person who was literally making the decisions about what stories went on the front page and what stories went inside was a very devout, ardent Catholic. And therefore I think, and that doesn't mean he was doing this out of any bias, but he noticed these stories, he focused on these stories, he was willing to put the stories on the front page, and other Jewish editors, and there were a number of them, were not willing to do that. They were not willing to say, look, here's a story about what's happening to the Jews in Europe, and advocate for it being on the front page in the same way that this other editor was. Yeah.
Through the memos that you read, do you get the feeling, did they actually come out and say, we don't want to be known as a Jewish paper and we can't put Jewish stories, or is it something that just everybody knew they weren't supposed to?
It was a little bit of both. I think it was to some extent a lot of this was understood, not spoken directly. But what the publisher would do would be, and the way you would see that would be that if there was ever any story that had anything to do with Jews, it went to the publisher. Even the most silly, mundane things. So, for example, there's a retirement party for the head of the Zionist Organization of America. The president resigns. And the editor asked the publisher how they should handle this story. And that's just one example of how everybody understood this was a sensitivity and that they needed to figure out how the publisher felt on it. But what you do see is in letters to outside people trying to explain the Times coverage, then you see the publisher saying these kinds of things. So, for example, 6 months after the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the Times runs an editorial about it. They didn't run an editorial while the ghetto was burning, but 6 months later they do an editorial, I guess, on the 6-month anniversary. And in it, they never mention Jews. They write a story about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and they refer to 400,000 persons. And then there's a editorial in the Jewish Times saying, how can you write an editorial about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and never mention Jews? So then the publisher starts getting letters from some of his friends saying, well, how did you do this? And what he says in response is, first of all, he says, we did write about it, and then he says, there was this story on page 17 about it where we did identify them as Jews. But then he says, but the reason we did it in the editorial is because Jews are a minority. As a minority, they can't save themselves. So the only way to help them is if we merge their cause with that of other people. So we don't want to single out Jews. We want it to be, part of this bigger struggle. And so he says that in a number of places to sort of explain his position and why the Times is doing that. So it's not so much in internal memos, but it's in explanations to people who are complaining about the coverage. And there were a number of people at the time that were saying, why aren't you treating this story with more importance? So this is not just after the fact criticism. It was subdued, but there was some criticism at the time, and certainly from Jewish critics who were just sort of desperately trying to figure out how they could get more press attention. Yes.
I'm just wondering, by not singling out Jews, whether indeed isn't he singling out Jews?
Right. Yes. I mean, it's certainly there's that irony in trying and the other irony that's related to that is what he would say is, I'm a journalist, I'm not, that comes first, I'm a journalist, but you can't help but feel that if he had reacted to the news as a journalist and not as a conflicted Jew, then what he would have said is, a large part of my audience desperately wants to know this information. It's incredibly important, and I should put it on the front page. But in sort of trying so hard not to be too much of a Jew, he ended up being less of a journalist, too. Yes,
Did it mean anything to Germany that we did not cover this?
Probably not once the war started. I mean, before the war, there was concern about public opinion, world opinion, and certainly one of the things, and this should be acknowledged, one of the things that the Germans did relatively effectively was they did talk about how the Jews controlled the media, and they singled out the Times for that. I mean, they would talk about the fact that the Times was owned by Jews, and they would talk about the fact it was owned by a German Jew, and that sort of played into their propaganda. So before the war that mattered. I think once the war started, first of all, we were at war, and even before the American government was, actively involved in the war, it still, I don't think it actually did matter much to the Germans. I mean, there might be some disagreement with that, but I don't think that it did. Only in the sense that it did mean that we weren't doing things like, bombing the railway lines to Auschwitz and bombing Auschwitz and that kind of thing. In concrete terms that of some of that. There was also one of the things that the Jewish groups wanted, and one of the reasons they wanted publicity both in the United States and in the occupied countries was to say, we're going to name who are committing these atrocities, and we're going to engage in more crimes, trials, and punishment after the war. So that probably did matter. I mean, that there wasn't as much of that, that might have made a difference, especially when it became clear that the Germans were going to lose the war. Had there been more attention and more sense that if you commit these atrocities, you're going to be punished for them, and that was clear in the press, that might have made a difference, I actually think. And that was actually one of the things, the War Refugee Board, when there was a U.S. government agency dedicated to trying to save Jews, that was one of their main strategies, was to get attention in the press, both in the United States and in the occupied countries, that would talk about naming people who had committed specific atrocities and making clear they were going to be punished once the war was over. One last question?
How did the Times today react to your research? Did you get any reaction from them?
Yeah, well, I sent a copy of my book to the publisher, and the publisher in the 1930s and 40s was a man named Arthur Sulzberger, and the publisher of the New York Times today is a man named Arthur Sulzberger. It's his grandson. So I got a note back saying, thank you for sending me a copy of your book, which I have read. I wish I could thank you for writing the book, but that would be a bridge too far. So I think Arthur Sulzberger reacted, probably not surprisingly, as if this was not news about some, distant person who managed the Times 60 years ago. He reacted like this was grandpa. and it was Grandpa. So, I think that's partially.
Was there any review of that book?
Huh?
Was there any review?
Yes, there was a review. We were talking about this over dinner. It was my least favorite review. I guess that would be a total surprise. And this is actually, I should say this. I mean, one of the reasons I emphasize this point about not continuing to claim that we didn't have the information is that there have been some instances in the New York Times review as one of them where the reviewer said, I mean, what he said in there is that nobody at the time could have possibly have fathomed what was happening to the Jews of Europe, even including the publisher of the New York Times. The review just basically repeats the conventional wisdom that the information wasn't available, and if it was available, it wasn't believed. And didn't take on at all, the fact that there were 1,200 news stories about it, and that the publisher often would write about what was happening and refer to those events. So that's one of the reasons I feel so strongly that, if nothing else, we need to sort of say, okay, we were getting this information, here was the information, and then we can start talking about why we responded to it the way that we did. But, you can't, and I would urge anybody who has nothing better to do, the Times now is digitized. When I started my research, it wasn't, so at least in that era. But now, you can sit down and you can look at all of these stories. I mean, the reviewer from the New York Times, if he wanted to, could have gone and looked at all 1,200 stories, and then he could have said nobody could have fathomed it, nobody could have possibly believed it. But, it's there. I mean, those stories are there, and if you look at them, you would have known what was happening pretty much completely as it was happening. And another thing is these stories are very accurate, too. I mean, there are a few things that are off here and there, but one of the things you can do with historical retrospectives is to say, okay, they're telling us this information, was it actually right? I mean, I would say it was about 85, 90% accurate.